All right, so the starting point for discussing comparative systems is to articulate some terminology. So first off, we have the state. Most of the time these days we refer to states as countries, not to be confused with what we here in the United States call states, which in most other places would be considered provinces. But in the most generic terms, a state is a political system that has authority or sovereignty, the ability to govern itself. A lot of times you'll hear it referred to as a political system, which is to say we've got politicians, we've got citizens, we've got rules, we've got things in place, the way things work. And so in that aspect, it's a very organic thing, the state, a place where things are happening politically. The nation, on the other hand, would be the people within that state who have a common identity, that have threads that hold them together. And in some situations, states are multinational, which is to say that we have multiple nations, and some states don't, or some nations don't have a state. For example, the Kurds in the Middle East are a nation of people that don't have a state, or the Native Americans that don't have a country in their own. And so we also had this ethnic groups, which are people that have been displaced or moved or have migrated. Sometimes borders have jumped over them, and ethnic groups, definitely have a big role within the political system, but they do differentiate from the nation of people. So, for example, the Native Americans have been in the same place. They are without a state. They do have governing bodies, but they're not necessarily sovereign. And don't have external authority and things like that. But ethnic groups have been moved. That's the main way to think of them. And so for the last couple of centuries, the dominant political system is the nation state, where we've had one nation of people within one state. So for example, in England, you had English people. In France, you had French people. And we're getting to the point now in modern times where, because of globalization, we've had so much crisscrossing of peoples that really most states are multinational now. In fact, we don't even call them national anymore. We call them ethnic groups because so many people have moved. And so now we're multi-ethnic or multicultural in most places in the world, especially here in the West. But the nation state is dying out. And because you don't have those same allegiances anymore, the things that drove us toward the world wars, for example, that competition that was driven by nationalism, we've kind of rejected that in the last half century or more. And so what's coming now is that we're kind of moving more toward regional governance or semi-global governance, where you've got things like the United Nations and the European Union and NATO and other alliances of various sorts that are kind of becoming, we're getting closer to the point where these bodies have the ability to govern. So it's not so much states anymore, but more the supranational global bodies. So we'll talk about them in a moment. So, for example, we have lots of organizations that we could point to for these supranational organizations. So these IGOs, or intergovernmental organizations, which are taking different people from different states, and they're collaborating on policy making, making treaties, and trying to, honestly, we're still kind of in the aftermath, in the grand scheme of things, of World War II, and trying to figure out ways to not kill each other in war. And so, for example, the European Union would be considered an intergovernmental organization, IGO. And so they set up their charter back in the aftermath of World War II, but the Maastricht Treaty of 1991 is the current charter that's in place. And so what the Europeans have decided, instead of having sole authority resting in the nation states, which of course is, from their perspective, has led to nothing but world wars, let's cooperate, let's collaborate, let's come up with a common currency to remove economic competition. Let's have common citizenship to make it so that we don't get these same rivalries and racism and xenophobia that is caused by nationalism. And so now, as a member of the European Union, you can crisscross the continent and have citizenship and the same privileges and rights anywhere that you are. And so the European Union is a perfect example of an IGO and how we're moving away from the nation state. We also got the United Nations, of course, which was also formulated after World War II, and this is, more of a fully global organization, and it's made up of two different bodies. The superpowers, the five superpowers, hold the Security Council. So the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China all have seats on the Security Council, and the big things go through the Security Council. They have to have unanimous votes. If any one of the members vetoes, then that measure does not carry. And then you've got the General Assembly, which is made up of all the other members that really don't have too much authority other than to participate in committees and the talking that goes into formulating agreements and treaties and things. And so the United Nations has, people put a lot of hope in that being the talking shop that's going to prevent future global wars. And it's been, I would say, successful in some ways and quite unsuccessful in others, because we've had plenty of wars and plenty of conflicts ever since the formulation of the United Nations. But it's an attempt, again, to kind of globalize this planet and make everybody attempt to be on the same page, or at least cooperate more effectively. We've also got economic IGOs like the International Monetary Fund, which is a sort of an emergency lender to countries that are in bad shape, or the World Bank, which is for long-term development, to give that added element of economic stability to countries that are developing, mainly in the third world. We've also got non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and these would be non-government factors, so interest groups that are global, charities, the Red Cross, for example, or others that are going to operate in multiple countries. Multinationals would also be considered NGOs to a degree, where these are businesses that are operating on a global scale. So we've got lots of big American companies and Japanese companies and European companies that do business all over the planet, and they're so big and powerful that if you have to deal with them in order to have sound economic systems in your country. So you may not like that, but organizations like Apple, or other tech companies, or whatever it may be, definitely have a presence at the table when it comes to economic policy making on a global scale. Constitutions are a pretty recent development. Of course, the United States is the trendsetter back in the late 1800s as to creating a document that is higher than just normal law. It establishes a general rule of law, or a governing principle, for a state and also the entire political system. So if you look at the American Constitution, it limits the government, at least it was supposed to in the beginning, but it also empowers that government. It says what the government can do and what it cannot do. The Bill of Rights in many constitutions is a limitation on what the government can do, and it provides civil liberty protections for the citizens. But the thing about a constitution is it's more about creating a government, saying what the government can do, what the government cannot do, and then all the gaps are filled in by laws passed by legislatures or whatever it may be in that political system. But constitutions are higher, constitutions are harder to change, and they're more set in stone. And so it both empowers and limits the government, but it also is kind of a mission statement about how that particular political system is supposed to work. So the Chinese Constitution gives us a mission statement on how the Chinese political system is supposed to work. The American one does it for the United States. The Mexican Constitution tells us how that whole thing. So it's kind of a blueprint for how that political system should work. Regime types is very important for when we start looking at different countries. We really have two types. We've got liberal democracies, where there is freedom, and then you have authoritarianism, where freedom is limited or non-existent. So the characteristics of a liberal democracy are going to be things that we're familiar with here in our system in America, because we are in fact a liberal democracy. So citizen rights, civil liberty protections, freedoms from the government. We are empowered to have certain privileges, civil rights, voting and education and employment and whatnot. We have competitive elections, the key word being competitive. Everybody has elections, but are they legit? Are they not fraudulent? Are they actually the will of the people? And are they done in a fair way? Is there a rule of law? Which means not only having laws, but as many people as possible in the political system are actually following them, including the government. We have lots of countries that have laws, but the government themselves are the ones least likely to follow those laws. In that situation, you would not have a rule of law, laws that are being followed. In a liberal democracy, you'll almost certainly have separation of powers, like we have in our three branches, and through federalism, through our national government and our regional governments, and some sort of checks and balances protocol, so that one part of the government is watching the other. And this could be both in terms of having an executive branch or a legislative branch, or bicameralism, or regional governments watching the national government. Any one of these factors could be a system of checks and balances. Within the system or the classification of liberal democracy, we also have different types. For example, a presidential system within a liberal democratic regime would have the president and the legislature elected separately, like we do in the United States. And this is also true in Mexico and Nigeria. We have separate elections for legislative seats and a separate election to elect the president. And the president's going to have fixed terms, express powers, and limitations of some sort. In a parliamentary regime, like we see in Great Britain, which is they're the founders of the classic parliamentary system. In this case, there really is no executive election. There are only elections for the legislature, or the House of Commons in Great Britain. And then out of the people who win seats in the House of Commons, a prime minister will emerge. So in other words, the prime minister is selected by the legislature, the parliament. And so the differences that emerge is that in a presidential system, you may have one party in control of the presidency and one party in control of the legislature, which is commonly the case in the United States. And if that happens, you wind up with a lot of gridlock, a lot of things not happening because they can't agree on anything. That scenario cannot happen necessarily in a parliamentary regime, or at least not as severely. In a parliamentary regime, if your party holds the legislature or the parliament, then the prime minister is going to come from that same party, which means there are few ways that the opposition can slow down the party that's in power. Now, there can be certain circumstances that we'll get to later where it does become more difficult, but you have far less gridlock in a parliamentary system. On the other hand, it makes it much more difficult in a parliamentary system for the opposition to stop the party that's in power. You have to wait for the next round of elections. We also have a semi-presidential system, which is what we have in Russia, which some countries, for whatever reason, have decided they needed to have a president and a prime minister. And in one or the other is going to have the real authority, and the other one is going to be kind of a figurehead of the government. In authoritarian regimes, all the things that we listed in the liberal democratic characteristics are going to be non-existent, or at least going to be pretended to exist but not really exist. So for example, they're going to have elections in authoritarian regimes. They're just not going to be competitive. And the reason they do that is they're trying to look democratic. They're trying to come off as if they are a liberal democracy, but in reality they're not, and in which case we oftentimes label them as illiberal democracies. There are limited or no rights for people or certain kinds of people. You're going to have very little checks and balances, limitations on government. The rule of law is going to be very shaky in most of these places because, again, who's going to hold them accountable? We have a couple different types, and it all kind of comes down to who's in charge of the authoritarian regime. So in an oligarchy, this is ruled by a few. And in some of the countries that we see, we'll come across the groups that are actually in charge. So for example, the religious scholars in Iran, the ulema, are going to be in charge there. The Communist Party, Politburo in China are the handful of people that really run the show of a country with so many people. Literally a handful of people are in charge. We may have a dictatorship as well. We think of the Hitler, we think of the Stalin as the dictators of an authoritarian system. And we have a couple of dictators, North Korea, for example, with Kim Jong-un. But those days are, there's not quite so many as we used to have in the real big totalitarian era around the world wars. And we also got military regimes. Oftentimes in Africa, for example, Nigeria has had military rule frequently. And when people with guns are walking into the streets, you pretty much do what they say, and that gives them a lot of authority, hence an authoritarian military regime. We can also look at this idea of the three worlds. Most people know the third world. We refer to states with little industry. They're mostly agrarian, to a degree impoverished. And we use that term. We've kept that term around. But really what this whole system comes from is the old Cold War model, the three worlds model. The first world war was everybody that was connected to the West, the liberal democracies. The second world were the communist states that were connected to the Soviet Union, mainly via the Warsaw Pact. And so since the liberal democracies have prevailed for the most part, and we only have a couple of communist states left, and China being a notable survivor, but we don't really see the world this way anymore. And it's kind of being played out still. The Cold War only ended a couple of decades ago, and we're kind of still in this, not sure of what direction we're going. But like I said, we have maintained the third world label for countries that are largely impoverished. They're not being fought over like they used to in the Cold War. This is why we use this terminology. The first two worlds were fighting to gain control of the third world, as if it was a big chess game. And we don't really see it that way anymore, but the terminology is useful. Economic systems go right alongside the political systems. So we have capitalism, of course, which is a total free market where the market is dictated by supply and demand. There are no price controls. And really in a true capitalist system that Adam Smith envisioned, there is no government regulation whatsoever. There are basically no existing countries in the world today where there is an absolutely true capitalist system. You can point to Singapore, you can point to Hong Kong. These are not necessarily countries, and so Singapore is, but not necessarily Hong Kong. And even then, you do have some restrictions. True capital, true laissez-faire, free market capitalism is kind of a hypothetical. There have been times in American history, particularly after the Civil War, before 1900, where we did have a pretty raging capitalist system. And there are winners and losers, and these days we don't kind of like the byproducts of true capitalism, which is to say that there are some who become immensely wealthy and some who stay poor. There's a wealth gap, and we've kind of rejected these things. Also, in modern democracy, governments and government personnel feel like they have to do something to warrant votes. And so it's almost irresistible for them to have to do something with the economy so that they could say they did something and then give you a reason to vote for them. Most countries these days do have a mixed economy, which is, and it can go on anywhere on the spectrum. You have a free market, but it is either lightly, moderately, or heavily regulated by the government in order to create more fairness. And so, for example, the Securities and Exchange Commission is overseeing markets here in the United States. We've got rules on businesses. We've got rules on farms. We've got labor regulations. We have all of these things in place that cut into the free market. But people believe this is a good thing. You're not going to have as much production as you would in a capitalist system, but you do have more fairness, supposedly. And so that's what most countries have opted for. Now, some countries would be considered a mixed economy, but are very much on the heavily regulated side. So you got a lot of socialist states in Europe that are very heavily regulated and are bordering on the third one, which would be the command economy. Command economies are kind of synonymous with the communist ideology, political ideology, which is a government's totally in control. There is no free market. There is no private land ownership. There is no private business. Prices are not set by the market. They're all set by the government. Government owns everything. Government controls everything. Government fixes everything in a command economy. And of course, the Soviet Union would have been the classic example of the command economy. Now, there's other countries that break the rules here on this economic system spectrum, and we have to give them a special classification, which is the rentier state. A rentier state is usually going to be very regulated and controlled by the government, but the idea is that their economy rests almost entirely on a single commodity, and usually we're talking about oil. So, for example, Iran and Nigeria are both completely or virtually completely reliant upon the oil market. And since it's so important that it means it's largely nationalized, controlled by the government, but there's really not a whole lot of other elements to their economy. There would be some. And so it just requires this special signifier of a single commodity economy as a rentier state. Now, when we look at economic systems, we also have to consider stages of economic development from a temporal sense. And so most Western nations these days, and also other countries around the world, are what we consider industrialized, meaning they have mass development of goods and services through industry, through business, very limited agriculture. They've figured out how to do agriculture in a way that will feed the people, but we do it largely in a mechanized way. We don't have a whole lot of people, actual human beings doing the labor in agriculture. But also a good educational system, which means you are producing an intelligible populace that can engage in white-collar work, or services, business, and you have less people wandering around for a job because they're unskilled and can only have agriculture. So Britain, Russia, China are all countries that we would consider industrialized. Mexico you may throw into that list as well. But the developing country would be a country that's in the process of moving out of an agrarian society more toward industrialization. So that's where Mexico has the asterisk. Most people would probably consider Mexico to be industrialized, but there are plenty of parts of the country. In fact, most of the country would be far better labeled as developing because of it is rural and impoverished, and low education levels and whatnot. So Iran, same kind of deal. Iran would be industrialized in many, many ways, but large swaths of the country would look to us to be developing. And Nigeria would clearly be in the developing column. A marginal state or a failed state, like Haiti, for example, would be among the poorest states in the world, very weak governments, bordering on anarchy, really no industrial output, virtually none, very little business, very few services, everything agriculture and small crafts and things like that, small shopkeepers. And it just really, nothing has ever taken root there to move the economy forward toward, at the very least, to being a developing country, and definitely not an industrialized country. Legitimacy is a concept that tells us is the country stable and how it's viewed by other states around the world. So when we say we have internal legitimacy, that means that things are stable within our borders and that citizens are participating in the political system. They're following the laws. They're engaging in elections. They're not rioting in the streets very much. And that would be internal legitimacy. External legitimacy would be the recognition of other states of your right to be sovereign and have existence. And so, for example, we have some countries in the world that do have internal stability and legitimacy, but are not necessarily recognized. So Taiwan, for example, is not recognized by very many countries around the world, but they are stable and they do have internal legitimacy. But these were the nationalists that fled out of China after their civil war when the communists took over. And so there are several locations like that. Legitimacy, mainly in terms of internal legitimacy, are exemplified through elections. When people are engaging in elections, that means they're buying into the system. They're not forcibly overthrowing or installing regimes. They realize there's a way to do it. There's a system of elections, and this is how we choose our leaders, and this is how things are done. We're going to go with the flow. But in other locations, it may be about ideology. When everybody has bought in to the rhetoric or to the political way of thinking, the dominant one, then people are on board. So when Iran, when you've got everybody believing that the Iranian Revolution was a good thing and that the theocratic system they have in place, run by the ulemas right now, is a good thing, then they've bought in. You have legitimacy. For Britain, it would be tradition. That people. You have a legitimate system when people are still loving the institutions and the traditions, royal weddings and Buckingham Palace, and people love this stuff in Britain. And so that, at least still today, that there is still some legitimacy and stability in Britain because people still cherish their heritage. Religion, obviously a very important part of any political system. As you can see here, we got the number breakdown of different religions in different countries all over the planet. From country to country, the numbers will obviously be different and have a major impact. Christianity is not just a Western faith. It is in Asia. It is in the Middle East. But Islam is predominantly in the Middle East, but also through globalization spreading throughout the world. These are political factors that must be considered. And in some countries, religion is the most important thing when it comes to people developing their political ideas. In some countries, the religion is part of the government. And so here in the West, we've downplayed religion in recent decades out of the center of society and made it more of a personal, private thing. The vast majority of the globe takes religion very seriously. And so whenever we're looking at a political system, we definitely need to take a look at religion. All right, here's the big one, ideology. What is the predominant political philosophy in the countries that we're taking a look at? So we have a full spectrum here, moving from left to right. Communism would be on the far left, and this is the belief that the government should be fully in control of all things, both political and economic and cultural, for that matter. And so it's expected that they'll have a command economy that is going to distribute the wealth perfectly equally, property rights non-existent. Basically the state is running your life and you are a piece of a machine. And this was exemplified through Stalinism in the Soviet Union, to a degree in China today, although they're not stone cold communist anymore. They used to be. But the main thing to think of when you talk about communism, it's love for the state. The state, the political system, is the thing that is dominant and the thing to be cherished, as opposed to fascism, which we'll get to in a moment, where you have a different focus, because they oftentimes look the same. Socialism is kind of communism light. So in this aspect, you have belief in a government that's not completely in charge of all things and not completely dominant, but does have authority to oversee things, to redistribute wealth, meaning the free market's going to create wealth in some places but not others, and it's the job in a socialist system for the government to redistribute that wealth, mainly through taxation. There are civil liberty protections. You do have private property protections and the ability to have self-ownership. Rights are protected. Government is limited to a degree, but it is very authoritative in order to kind of pull the strings of society in order to create equity and fairness. If you move more to the right, you get classical liberalism, which should not be confused with the other two modern uses of the term liberal. Really, modern liberalism as a label is a misnomer. Liberalism means, in the classical sense, that government is very limited, that there are free markets, that government doesn't interfere in your life, in your economic decision making. Government is potentially vulnerable to committing tyranny, and so therefore must be limited and defined with constitutions, lots of citizen rights and freedoms. This is basically the Enlightenment philosophy. The United States Constitution, the Founding Fathers were very much of this, cut from this cloth of classical liberalism. And this would be considered conservatism these days, or neoconservatism these days. And then on the far right, you have fascism. Fascism is a belief in an all-powerful government, just like we saw in communism. But in this case, it's not necessarily to create fairness and an exact equity. It's more about eliminating inferior elements through police power and basically uplifting the dominant nation or the dominant people group. And so in this aspect, if you're not part of the dominant group, then you're either going to be eliminated or removed or have virtually no rights at all. So obviously Nazi Germany is the classic example of fascism. The German race to the Nazis was the dominant race, and government was inflated to become all powerful in order to protect that nation and make it be the dominant nation. And anybody else who was inferior, like the Jews living in Germany, were removed, cracked down on, and had no rights whatsoever. So it's love for the nation. Both communism and fascism have authoritative governments, but for communism, it's for the exalting of the state, and particularly the government, whereas in fascism, it's for the nation to upload. It's extreme nationalism is what it is. Now today, where do we see fascism the most? Well, we might call Islamofascism in places like Iran, where citizens that subscribe to the Muslim religion and are in line with the powers that be in those countries that are religious folks, you're going to be good if you're on that team. If you're an outsider, you're from a different religion or from a different ethnic group, then in some countries like Iran, you're going to be oppressed. So that's kind of the best example of fascism in the modern world today.